Welcome back again, gang. This is part 3 of our lecture series for chapter 25 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty, by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled Lyndon Johnson's Presidency. The focus question for this section is, what were the purposes and strategies of Johnson's Great Society programs? Immediately upon assuming the presidency in 1963, LBJ called on Congress to continue work on JFK's Civil Rights Bill. This led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibited racial discrimination in employment, public institutions, and privately owned public accommodations. It also banned discrimination based on sex. However, the law did not address issues of disenfranchisement or voting rights. Neglect in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to address issues of voting rights led to a shift in the civil rights movement away from issues of segregation towards issues of equal access to the vote for all people regardless of race. To address the omission of voting rights from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a coalition of civil rights groups started a voter registration drive in Mississippi, an initiative that was dubbed Freedom Summer. These activists were met with profound violence, bombings, beatings, even murders. And when 2 white activists were killed, this grabbed national attention and galvanized the movement around issues of voting rights. Before Johnson could continue with any civil rights initiatives, he had to face election in 1964. Civil rights groups in general rallied behind Johnson's campaign, mostly due to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Johnson so forcefully endorsed. Barry Goldwater was the Republican nominee, and his campaign rhetoric centered around this concern about the New Deal welfare state and the growth in the size and the scope of the United States government. Johnson, mostly thanks to the heightened awareness of civil rights issues in this period and Johnson's support for such issues, won by a landslide and had majorities in both houses of Congress. However, the election did mark a resurgence of American conservatism. Even though the 60s in general has gone down in history as sort of a period of a profound liberal turn in American society and politics, underneath that was also a rising new conservative movement as well. As I've said before, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And American conservatives certainly responded to the liberal activities around civil rights issues and other issues in this period. Perhaps the leading conservative in the 60s was a gentleman by the name of William F. Buckley, this man you see right here in this photograph. He was a conservative intellectual, and he formed a group called Young Americans for Freedom. And this group issued what became known as the Sharon Statement, which advocated for the free market as the basis for personal freedom, limited government, and the destruction of global communism in the Cold War. Conservatism actually did gain a foothold in this period thanks to efforts of conservatives like William F. Buckley, and particularly in Southern California and the Southwest. An example of this was Proposition 14 in California, which repealed a law banning racial discrimination in real estate sales. And in general, conservatives capitalized on racial division. And this is the period when you begin to see a shift in the political parties themselves, where the Democrats became the party of civil rights and African Americans and their issues, while the Republicans, who had formerly been the party of civil rights and African American issues, now became the party of conservative politics, and many of the old conservative Democrats, particularly from the South, began to shift sides in this period and move over to the Republican Party, as African Americans, for their part, shifted sides away from the Republican Party and began to join the Democratic Party. The efforts to secure voting rights for African Americans culminated in an event in Selma, Alabama in 1965 that became known as Bloody Sunday. Martin Luther King Jr. led a voting rights drive in Selma, Alabama in 1965 and attempted to gather a group of protesters to march from the city of Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, Alabama. Police met them along the way and attacked the marchers with cattle prods, whips, tear gas, and other violent acts towards these protesters. Once again, as before in like Birmingham and other situations, the images of the violence that the authorities inflicted upon these protesters was broadcast on television, which led to another public outcry, which forced Congress to take action. Johnson asked Congress to enact a law securing the right to vote, which led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed federal officials to register voters. Where the problem here at this time was not that African Americans were legally barred from registering to vote. They had to pass literacy tests, they had to pay poll taxes, but ultimately they had to be allowed by their local authorities to register in the first place. And often, especially in the Deep South, the local authorities would jump through hoops to try to prevent African Americans from even registering to begin with. With the Voting Rights Act, this allowed the federal government to step in and register these African American voters. The 24th Amendment was also passed in this period, which outlawed the poll tax, one of the fundamental discriminatory aspects of voting in this period that prevented many African Americans from voting because they could not afford to pay that poll tax. Much like previous presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal, or Harry Truman and his Fair Deal, LBJ also had a vision for progress in this period that he dubbed the Great Society. This was the name of a series of initiatives that the Johnson administration put in place between 1965 and 1967. Such initiatives included health services to the poor and elderly, the Medicaid and Medicare programs, efforts for education and urban development, as well as new government agencies such as the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. All in all, these measures that made up this Great Society drive of LBJ further expanded the role and the reach of the federal government and reflected the hopes of Democratic liberals that the economic expansion of the 1960s would fund ambitious programs and improve the overall quality of life for all Americans. The centerpiece of LBJ's Great Society initiatives was his War on Poverty, which was a crusade to eradicate poverty from the United States. Such efforts that fell under this umbrella of the War on Poverty included the beginning of the food stamp programs, other programs that were designed to equip the poor with skills and rebuild their motivation, including job training programs, Head Start or early childhood education programs, legal services, college scholarships, and more. All of this fell under the umbrella of the idea of freedom from want, one of the centerpieces of FDR's Four Freedoms ideology. Johnson's argument was that economic liberty meant more than equal opportunity, and some needed more assistance than others. All in all, LBJ's War on Poverty was the most expansive U.S. government effort in history to help the least advantaged Americans. And the programs did help, but they did not eradicate poverty, as is obvious, as poverty, of course, still exists today within the United States. This also faced some conservative backlash, as the conservative argument against LBJ's War on Poverty was that such government programs, especially things like food stamps and other direct government assistance like that, made the poor dependent on the government and actually de-incentivized them from becoming motivated to take care of themselves and gain the skills necessary to acquire these sorts of jobs that would allow them to move up in the economic and social hierarchy of the country. And under this conservative argument, the War on Poverty actually exacerbated poverty rather than eradicated it. That concludes part 3 of our Chapter 25 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.